Solomon Drake, a self-made billionaire with a story of resilience, meets Michael Lewis, a man lost in the chaos of life. But on a fateful flight, an unexpected connection sparks a transformation. What happened that made them rethink everything? The journey from prejudice to compassion begins now. The hum of the airplane engines droned like a sorrowful lullaby, blending with the soft glow of lights embedded in the cabin ceiling. The overnight flight from New York to Los Angeles passed in hushed silence. Passengers dragged their suitcases through the narrow aisle. Some had reclined their seats, seeking a brief, restless sleep in the midst of the journey. Their weary faces bore the weight of solitude, as if each person was lost in their own private story. A flight attendant offered a gentle smile to each passenger, but the scattered gazes barely acknowledged her presence. The atmosphere in the economy cabin was stifling and dull, a long journey mirroring the arduous paths of those on board. Michael stepped through the airplane door, his posture slumped with exhaustion. His pale blue dress shirt was wrinkled after a grueling day, the collar undone in careless disregard. His red striped tie hung askew, loose like his life at that moment, unraveling, with nothing left to hold it together. He dragged his worn leather bag down the aisle, his scuffed black dress shoes tapping against the airplane floor with heavy, deliberate steps. Michael thought to himself, another meaningless trip. No job, no plan, no future. The American dream? That's for someone else. And me? 15 years of loyalty to the company, and they tossed me aside like a piece of trash. Michael paused, glancing around the crowded cabin, searching for a familiar face but finding none. He sighed, his shoulders sinking under the weight of defeat. Near the back of the plane, a middle-aged black man sat quietly. Solomon Drake, dressed in simple jeans and a gray button-down shirt, exuded no air of grandeur or detachment. In his hands was a hardcover book. The bold title on the cover gleamed under the soft light. Letters from a Self-Made Man. Solomon turned each page deliberately, his gaze contemplative yet alive with wisdom. He read slowly, savoring every word, as if the book was a feast meant to be relished rather than hurried through. The plane had stabilized in the air. The steady hum of the engines droned on. The cabin lights were dimmed, casting a soft, hazy glow that created an atmosphere of muted stillness. Michael leaned back in his seat, his eyes closed, though his mind raced with restless, unrelenting thoughts. Solomon remained engrossed in his book, yet every now and then, he cast a sidelong glance at the man seated next to him, a man he instinctively felt was burdened by some heavy sorrow. Michael opened his eyes and caught sight of the book Solomon was reading. The title on the cover stood out clearly. Letters from a Self-Made Man. He furrowed his brow slightly. Breaking the silence, Michael spoke, his voice raspy and devoid of enthusiasm. Business trip? Solomon gently closed the book, resting it on his lap, and offered a faint smile. No, I just wrapped up a presentation on entrepreneurship. Michael's gaze lingered on him, his eyebrows drawing together in subtle skepticism. The man's simple attire, faded jeans, and an unremarkable button-down shirt didn't align with his mental image of a successful entrepreneur. Entrepreneurship? You're a businessman? Solomon nodded, his tone steady and calm. I'm the founder of Drake Industries. A flicker of astonishment crossed Michael's face. The name was familiar, Drake Industries, a tech giant leading innovations in artificial intelligence and sustainable development. His eyes narrowed, his expression tinged with doubt. Drake Industries? I thought the founder was a billionaire. Solomon chuckled softly, as though accustomed to such reactions. That's correct. Crossing his arms, he leaned back in his seat, his eyes subtly studying the man beside him. "You don't look much like a billionaire." Solomon didn't respond right away. He sat quietly for a moment, as though weighing his words. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but edged with an undeniable firmness. "People tend to have preconceived notions about what success looks like. Reality, however, is often very different." Michael, unsettled, turned his gaze toward the airplane window. His thoughts churned. A billionaire? This guy? No way. He doesn't look like anything special. Just another ordinary passenger. After a moment, he broke the silence again, his tone dry and tinged with disbelief. "So, what did you talk about? How to make your first million?" Solomon shook his head, his eyes distant, as if recalling something deeply meaningful. "No, I spoke about building a sustainable community. Success isn't just about money." A faint, derisive snort escaped Michael. "Sounds like a morality lecture. But in the end, you're still a billionaire. Money's the most important thing, isn't it?" Solomon held his gaze, unwavering. His voice dropped lower, resonating with gravity. "Money solves problems, but it can't buy everything. You can have all the money in the world and still feel empty if you don't know what you're living for." Solomon remained silent for a few seconds after the pointed remark. He didn't frown or show any hint of irritation. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his eyes glinting with a pensive air, as though carefully weighing his response. With a faint smile and a steady, deliberate tone, he finally spoke. "Sometimes, people don't see the journey others have taken. They only see the final result." The words hung in the air, slow and deliberate, like drops of water falling into the stillness between them. The quiet tension between the two men grew heavier. Michael turned towards Solomon, his gaze probing. "Journey? What do you mean by that?" Solomon placed the book on his lap, leaned back in his seat, and clasped his hands together. "I mean that success isn't always what people imagine. It doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't come solely from luck or privilege." Michael snorted, his skepticism cutting through the subdued cabin air. "Yet here you are, a billionaire. Don't you think you've had some advantages?" Solomon paused again, recognizing the prejudice laced in Michael's words, a familiar refrain he had heard countless times before. "He's just like the others," Solomon thought. "They see what I have today, the wealth, the recognition, but no one sees the years I fought to get here. The nights spent sleeping in my car. The meetings denied because of the color of my skin. The people who turned their backs on me when I needed them most." Solomon's gaze softened, shifting from scrutiny to something closer to empathy. He spoke quietly, but his words were resolute. "I once had to sleep in my car for 3 months when I started out. I was rejected by people who didn't want to work with someone like me." Michael froze, caught off guard by the raw admission. "Someone like you?" Solomon nodded. "That's right. A black man from a poor neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. Some things don't change, no matter how good your ideas are or how hard you work." He turned his head away, his expression darkening as memories surfaced. His words lingered in Michael's mind, stirring thoughts he had long buried. Sleeping in a car? Rejected because of his skin color? And yet, he succeeded. But what about me? Michael's eyes narrowed, a mix of discomfort and curiosity flickering across his face. Solomon picked up his book again and turned to a fresh page. Under the dim airplane lights, the title on the cover, "Letters from a Self-Made Man," gleamed, a subtle reminder laden with meaning. Success doesn't always come from privilege. It comes from what you do when every door is closed. The cabin returned to its quiet hum, but between the two men, a seed of conflict had begun to take root. He closed his eyes, but the conversation replayed endlessly in his mind. The foundations of his long-held prejudices began to waver, leaving him more unsettled than ever. Solomon, the man with his unassuming demeanor, seemed to possess an understanding of something Michael couldn't grasp, something that eluded him entirely. The airplane continued its journey through the stillness of the night sky, carrying with it unanswered questions and the weight of unspoken thoughts. Solomon turned another page of his book, but his eyes no longer focused on the words. The steady drone of the airplane engines provided a somber backdrop to the unspoken tension simmering between the two men. Michael studied Solomon, a mix of curiosity and discomfort churning inside him. The man's earlier words about sleeping in his car and facing rejection because of his skin color echoed persistently in Michael's mind. Yet he couldn't accept those truths so easily. He broke the silence, his voice laced with skepticism. You must have had connections. Regular people like us don't just rise to the top like that. Solomon didn't flinch at the question. He leaned back in his seat, his gaze drifting toward the airplane window, where the glittering lights below stretched across the darkness like remnants of old memories. For a moment, he said nothing, as if he were retracing the painful steps of his journey. I've heard this question so many times before. They always assume success comes from luck, privilege, or hidden connections. But they don't see the scars I carry, the sleepless nights, the broken dreams, the doors slammed in my face because I didn't look like them. He exhaled slowly and turned back to Michael, his dark eyes calm yet profound, like a lake after a storm. No, Solomon said, his voice steady, deliberate. I didn't have special connections. What I had was a mother who worked herself to the bone and a kid who believed he could do more. Michael raised an eyebrow, doubt still etched across his face. And what about investors? Surely they helped you out. Solomon chuckled softly, though the sound carried no real amusement, only a quiet understanding. No investor touched my project in the early years. Most wouldn't even meet with me. He spoke slowly, his words deliberate. I knocked on doors, sent out hundreds of emails, and got nothing but rejection. Some of them didn't bother to hide it. They told me outright, they don't invest in people like me. Solomon shook his head, a faint, bitter smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It sounds like one of those stories of triumph over adversity, doesn't it? But I've seen enough to know no one makes it without at least a bit of luck or help along the way. His gaze met Michael's, sharp for the first time, cutting through the haze of doubt. Do you think everyone starts at the same starting line? Michael flinched slightly at the question. No, of course not. But Solomon didn't wait for him to finish. His voice remained calm, but the weight of his experience bore down on every word. I started far behind the line. To get here, I had to run faster, farther, and longer than anyone could imagine. The words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. Faster, farther, and longer. Images flickered in his mind, of himself, running a race he could never seem to win, working tirelessly to hold onto his job. But he had failed. And now, this man beside him, a billionaire, spoke of a journey that sounded eerily familiar, except Solomon had reached the finish line. Michael didn't want to believe it. Something about it felt deeply unfair. He crossed his arms over his chest, his eyes narrowing as he searched for cracks in the story. But you made it. So, what changed your fate? Solomon tilted his head slightly, his gaze distant, fixed on some invisible point beyond the confines of the airplane cabin. Faith. Michael's brow furrowed, his frustration breaking through. Faith? You mean those cheesy motivational slogans? That's not realistic. Solomon didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned another page in his book, his focus returning to the words on the paper. Under the dim cabin light, the title, Letters from a Self-Made Man, glimmered once more, offering an unspoken answer. Faith in yourself is something no one can take away, not even when every door is slammed shut. Solomon remained silent for a few seconds after Michael's skeptical question. His gaze shifted to the airplane window, his eyes lost in memories from a distant, harsher past. When he finally spoke, his voice was warm yet heavy, like the echo of a story carved into his soul. Do you know Chicago? I grew up in Southside, the kind of place where every night, the sound of gunshots echoed through the alleys. He paused, his eyes clouded with reflection. In Southside, people didn't ask, "How are you?" They asked, "Are you still alive?" Michael was taken aback. He'd heard of Southside, famous for its violence and poverty, but he never imagined a tech billionaire could have emerged from such a place. Solomon continued, his tone steady but weighted with hard-earned truths. My father died when I was 7. My grandmother used to say he didn't die of illness but of exhaustion, working 3 shifts a day at a steel mill. He glanced at his hands, as if he could still see traces of his father's struggle etched into them. My mother did whatever it took to keep us afloat. She cleaned houses, waited tables, and sometimes worked the night shift at a garment factory. Michael looked at Solomon, his expression a mix of confusion and curiosity. But did your mom help you in any special way? I mean, did she give you some kind of unique opportunity? A faint, bittersweet smile crossed Solomon's face. Special opportunity? No. She gave me only one thing, her unwavering belief that if I worked hard enough, I could escape the cycle of poverty. His voice dropped, a quiet gravity settling over his words. But even when I tried, there were things that hard work couldn't change. He exhaled slowly, his gaze growing deeper, darker. I once applied for a scholarship. My essay ranked first, but I was rejected anyway. Michael raised an eyebrow, surprise flickering across his face. Why? Did you do something wrong? Solomon shook his head, his voice calm yet resolute. I didn't do anything wrong, but I wasn't the kind of person they wanted. They didn't want to see a black kid standing on that stage, accepting a prestigious award. Michael sat in stunned silence, his assumptions beginning to waver. Solomon's voice softened, almost like a whisper to himself. I applied to dozens of tech companies. No one responded. Some openly told me that the name Solomon Drake didn't fit their company culture. Michael leaned back in his seat, his focus now entirely on the man beside him. Wait, you're saying they rejected you because of your name? Solomon nodded. Yes, they didn't need to meet me. The name alone was enough for them to decide. Michael felt a lump forming in his throat. I thought he had some kind of advantage, but the truth is, he didn't know what to say. Solomon offered a small, almost comforting smile, as if reassuring himself more than anyone else. But those rejections taught me something important. He turned to Michael, his eyes sharp yet kind, carrying the weight of a lesson learned through fire. When the world closes its doors on you, you have to build your own. That's how I created Drake Industries. Michael didn't respond, but something in his expression shifted. The skepticism that had once clouded his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet awe and perhaps a touch of respect. Solomon's story had started to pierce through the walls of doubt Michael had built, forcing him to confront the biases he'd long held as truths. Solomon quietly turned another page of his book, though his eyes no longer lingered on the words. Instead, they drifted to the endless expanse of darkness outside the airplane window. He knew his story might make others reflect, but he also understood that changing someone's perspective didn't happen overnight. Michael sat there, his gaze distant, lost in thought. The silence between them stretched for several seconds before he finally broke it, his voice heavy with suppressed emotion. "But now you're a billionaire." He leaned toward Solomon, his eyes tense, searching. "You can't possibly understand the struggles people like us face anymore." Solomon tilted his head slightly, his expression contemplative. He didn't respond immediately. He recognized that Michael's words weren't just rooted in skepticism. They were born from pain and frustration, emotions he could almost feel radiating from the man. He studied Michael for a long moment, as though trying to glimpse the scars beneath the surface. "He thinks money can heal every wound. But some wounds never heal. The losses, the prejudice, the rejection, they stay with you, even if you have the world in your hands." Solomon let out a quiet sigh and finally spoke. "Do you think money changes everything?" Michael shrugged, letting out a bitter laugh. "At the very least, it keeps people from worrying about the little things. No stress over rent or where the next meal is coming from." Solomon nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in that. "You're right. Money can buy security." He paused, and a deep sadness flickered in his eyes. "But it can't give you respect if people have already decided you're not worthy of it." Michael shook his head, his voice sharp and defiant. "Easy for you to say when you're sitting at the top." Straightening in his seat, Solomon's tone grew firmer, though he maintained his composure. "Do you think I don't know what loss feels like? Do you think becoming a billionaire meant every door suddenly opened for me? The truth is, some doors stayed locked, simply because of who I am." Michael faltered, his confidence wavering for a brief moment before he masked it with a sarcastic smirk. "You're telling me that even with billions of dollars, you're still a victim of prejudice?" Solomon remained unflinching, his voice steady. "Not a victim. A survivor. I've learned to live with it, to not let it control me. But don't mistake that, it's still there. It lingers in the way people look at me, in the whispers behind my back." Michael leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms over his chest, his expression a mix of defiance and unease. "So, you're saying the odds were stacked against you, and yet here you are." Solomon's calm gaze didn't waver. "Not everything was against me, but enough was. Enough to make me realize I had to work twice, 3 times as hard as others just to be seen as their equal." The silence between them grew heavy, the hum of the airplane engines filling the void. Michael stared out the window, but his eyes were no longer focused on the nightscape below. He was wrestling with himself. Part of him wanted to believe Solomon's story, while another part clung tightly to the prejudices he'd held for so long. Finally, he turned back, his voice softer, but still tinged with doubt. "So, you overcame all of it with just faith?" "I don't buy it. Maybe you just got lucky. Right place, right time." Solomon smiled faintly, as though he'd anticipated the question. "There's no right place, no right time. Just persistence and determination, even when everything seems to be against you." Solomon sat quietly, his gaze still fixed on the airplane window. Outside, the dark sky stretched endlessly, mirroring the memories he was about to unearth. When he spoke, his voice was slow, laced with a faint quiver that betrayed the weight of his emotions. "You're right. I have money. I have fame. But money can't solve everything." He paused, as if dredging up the most painful memory of his life. When my company finally started to succeed, I thought I could change my mother's life. After all the sacrifices she made, I wanted her to live her final years in peace. His voice caught for a moment, and he swallowed hard. When he continued, his words were quieter, but they cut through the silence like a blade. But then one day, my mother was admitted to the hospital. Michael straightened slightly, sensing the heaviness in Solomon's story. Leaning forward, Solomon clasped his hands together, his fingers tightening as he spoke. His tone was steady, but every word carried the weight of grief. They didn't see her right away. They said she had to wait. He paused, his breath shaky as he fought to keep his composure. I begged them to prioritize her. But they just looked at me, then at her, and said she wasn't a top priority. Michael frowned slightly, the words unsettling him. "Do you know what I realized?" Solomon asked, his voice turning bitter, edged with the pain of old wounds. At that moment, I had everything: money, fame, power. But none of it could change the way they looked at her. To them, she was just an old black woman, not worth their attention. Michael remained silent, his gaze wavering as the impact of Solomon's words sank in. Solomon continued, his tone sharper now, colder. "I could buy a building. I could buy a hospital. But I couldn't buy compassion from those people." His hands, clenched tightly, slowly relaxed, as if releasing a burden he had carried for far too long. She passed away a few days later. I thought I could change her life. But I was too late. Michael lowered his head, the weight of Solomon's story leaving him speechless. I always thought money could fix everything. But maybe I was wrong. For years, Michael had believed that people like Solomon, with their wealth and status, never had to face the injustices that ordinary people like him endured. But now, he realized there were wounds that money could never heal. Solomon turned back to the window, his expression distant, as if he could see a shadow of the past. His mother, tirelessly working her entire life, only to face the same indifference and unfairness at the end. In Michael's mind, Solomon's words echoed like an unshakable truth. Some wounds never heal, no matter how much money you have. Michael remained silent, his head bowed, hands clasped tightly together. His eyes drifted downward, as though searching for answers he wasn't sure he would ever find. The steady hum of the airplane engines filled the void between them. Neither man spoke another word, yet the silence carried a gravity greater than anything they could have said. Outside the window, the darkness still enveloped the world. But far in the distance, a faint light began to stretch across the horizon, a quiet promise of dawn. Michael thought to himself, maybe life isn't as simple as I once believed. Maybe success isn't just about money. And maybe I've been missing something far more important all along. The plane continued its journey through the night, carrying with it the unresolved thoughts of two men, two individuals who seemed worlds apart, yet shared more in common than either had ever imagined. The plane trembled slightly, at first just a gentle sway, as though brushing against a patch of turbulence. Then, it began to shake violently. The cabin lights flickered, and the engines groaned with unsettling sounds. Michael shot upright in his seat, his hands gripping the seat in front of him. His heart pounded wildly in his chest. Beside him, Solomon looked up from his book, his calm eyes scanning the cabin, now descending into chaos. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, but the reassurance it tried to offer only added to the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a technical issue. Please remain calm and use your oxygen masks if necessary." Instead of soothing the passengers, the announcement ignited a new wave of panic. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, dangling like ghostly apparitions in front of terrified faces. A young mother clutched her toddler tightly, her trembling hands fumbling to secure the mask over her child's tiny face. The cries of children mixed with the frantic shouts of passengers. "Oh God, what's happening? Are we going to crash?" Voices calling out to loved ones echoed through the cabin, their fear-laden tones cutting through the air. Eyes filled with dread darted around, reflecting the collective terror of people staring into the possibility of death. Michael gripped the seat tighter, his breaths shallow and erratic. The mask dangled in front of him, swaying slightly, but he made no move to put it on. He turned to look at Solomon. To his astonishment, Solomon remained unervingly calm. Despite the chaos around them, his steady gaze didn't waver. Solomon's eyes swept the cabin, not with panic, but with a deliberate, searching intent. Nearby, an elderly woman struggled with her mask, her frail hands trembling as she tried to secure it. Solomon stood without hesitation, bending down to help her. "Let me assist you." His voice was steady, devoid of fear. The woman clung to his hand, her eyes filled with gratitude as he gently fastened the mask over her face. Michael watched, a mixture of disbelief and awe flashing across his face. In his mind, questions surged uncontrollably. How can he stay so calm? Isn't he afraid? His heart raced faster, his breathing grew more labored. I always thought money could buy safety. But now, on this flight, what does money even mean? He clenched his fists tighter. I thought I knew everything. But maybe I was wrong. Solomon returned to his seat, his expression resolute. His movements were deliberate, his demeanor radiating a quiet strength. He met Michael's wide-eyed stare, his voice calm but firm. "Put your mask on. Everything will be fine." Michael stared at Solomon, his hands frozen in place. "You're not afraid?" Solomon gave him a faint smile, one filled with understanding. "Of course I am." He sat down and carefully tightened his seatbelt. But fear doesn't solve problems. Michael stayed silent, his mind churning. He knew Solomon was right, yet the doubt and conflict within him refused to settle. Some passengers had begun to regain their composure, but the tension in the cabin remained thick, as if everyone were bracing for the worst. Solomon tilted his head slightly, his gaze resting on Michael. There are things in life you can't control, but you can always control how you respond to them. Michael lowered his head, silent. Inside, his inner turmoil remained unresolved. Yet, for the first time, he began questioning the beliefs he had clung to for so long. The air in the cabin remained stifling and chaotic. Cries of children and panicked voices calling out to one another filled the space. A black woman seated a few rows ahead clutched her young child tightly, tears streaming down her face. She tried desperately to secure the oxygen mask on her child, but her trembling hands couldn't hold the strap steady. Solomon unbuckled his seatbelt and walked over to her. He knelt down, his steady hands taking hold of the mask. With a calm precision, he gently secured it over the child's face, who was wailing uncontrollably. "We're going to be okay. Just breathe deeply," he said, his voice low and reassuring, cutting through the chaos like an anchor of stability. The woman looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes clinging to him like a fragile thread of hope. I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice breaking. Solomon placed his hands firmly on her shoulders, his tone steady yet kind. "Stay calm. Breathe deeply. Your child needs you to be strong." She nodded, tears still falling. but her hands stopped trembling as she gained control of herself. Solomon helped her put on her own mask, then stood up, scanning the cabin. Michael sat frozen, his eyes fixed on Solomon. While the other passengers were consumed by their fear, Solomon maintained an extraordinary calm. He wasn't just looking out for himself. He moved with purpose, helping others without hesitation. He's not just a businessman. He's a leader. Someone who doesn't forget the people who need help. Michael tightened his grip on the seat, his emotions swirling in conflict. He had always believed that people like Solomon, successful and wealthy, only cared about themselves and their fortune. But what he was witnessing was entirely different. As the chaos began to settle, Solomon returned to his seat. He adjusted his own oxygen mask, his eyes scanning the cabin once more, as if ensuring no one else needed help. Michael hesitated for a moment, then unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped toward Solomon. This time, the look in his eyes held no trace of prejudice or doubt. Instead, there was curiosity and a flicker of admiration. He stood there for a moment before speaking, his voice uncertain. "Aren't you afraid?" Solomon looked up, offering a faint smile. "Of course I am." He nodded, his gaze steady and sincere. "But fear doesn't solve problems. Action does." Michael remained silent, standing there, his eyes locked on Solomon. Inside, his mind churned with thoughts that felt like uncharted territory. "Action does." Solomon's words echoed in his head, opening a door, a new perspective on life and what it truly meant to succeed. Michael sat in silence, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. Solomon's words about action over fear echoed relentlessly in his mind. Before he could delve deeper into his thoughts, Solomon spoke again, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of raw emotion. "Do you know why I built Drake Industries?" Michael looked up, surprised. He had assumed the answer would be the usual: money, ambition, or a desire to lead the tech industry. But Solomon met his eyes, and within them, Michael saw a profound sadness. "I didn't build this company to make money," Solomon said softly. He bowed his head, his hands clasped together as if cradling memories from a long time ago. "I built it to help people like my mother, people who fight every single day just to survive." Solomon took a deep breath, as though drawing strength to continue. "My mother was the strongest person I've ever known. She didn't have a degree. She didn't have connections. But she had determination to give me a better life." His voice wavered slightly, and his eyes glimmered with pain as he recalled the past. "She worked from dawn until dusk, yet every night, she would come home, smile at me, and say, 'You'll do more than this. You'll have opportunities one never had.'" He paused, his voice catching as he recounted her final wish. "She once told me she dreamed of a day when people like us wouldn't have to beg for opportunities, but could create them ourselves." Michael stood frozen, feeling the weight of Solomon's words settle over him. He looked at Solomon, and something shifted in his eyes. What he heard wasn't the story of a man chasing wealth, but of a son carrying his mother's legacy. A legacy of perseverance, of defying the odds, and refusing to surrender to adversity. Michael's inner voice rose, filled with emotion. "He's not who I thought he was. He doesn't just think of himself, he thinks of the people left behind." Lowering his head, Michael clenched his hands tightly. "I was wrong. My prejudices blinded me to the truth. Maybe, instead of blaming life, I should start doing something to change it." Solomon lifted his head, his gaze unwavering and resolute. He looked directly at Michael, but there was no judgment in his eyes, only compassion and understanding. His voice rang out, calm yet powerful, each word resonating like a profound lesson. We can't change the world with money alone. He paused, ensuring that Michael was truly listening. We change the world by helping others stand with us. Michael raised his head, his eyes locking onto Solomon's. For the first time, he felt he had truly learned something from this man. His gaze softened, filled not with envy or skepticism, but with admiration, not for Solomon's wealth or success, but for the quiet strength of his character and the compassion he carried within him. The steady hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as a moment of stillness passed between them. Through the window, the first rays of dawn began to break, chasing away the darkness of the long night. The light fell across Michael's face, a silent reminder that each new day brought the opportunity for change. Michael drew a deep breath, his eyes alight with a newfound resolve. His inner voice echoed with clarity. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe, instead of blaming the world, it's time I started acting to change it. The plane flew steadily through the morning sky, carrying two men who had once held opposing beliefs but were now united in a shared vision. A better world, where opportunities were created for everyone. Michael sat upright, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze distant as it drifted out the airplane window. Outside, the sky was beginning to brighten. The first rays of sunlight broke through the thick clouds, casting a soft glow across the horizon. But his mind wasn't on the view. It was tangled in a web of chaotic thoughts, like a reel of slow-motion footage replaying the events that had just unfolded. What had Solomon done? He recalled the image of Solomon unbuckling his seatbelt, stepping forward to help the panicked woman. His calm voice cutting through the chaos. "We're going to be okay. Just breathe deeply." Michael closed his eyes, the memory vivid. He had once been that kind of person, a man who believed in helping others, someone who valued compassion above all else. But somewhere along the way, that part of him had slipped away without him even realizing it. "I've spent my entire life chasing my career, but I've never stopped to ask, what have I done for anyone else? I've always blamed the world for being unfair, always thought I deserved more. But maybe I've forgotten what truly matters." He let out a quiet sigh, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his reflection. "Maybe that's why I feel so empty." Beside him, Solomon observed Michael silently. He noticed the subtle shift in the man's demeanor. The hardness and skepticism that had once filled his eyes were gone, replaced by something softer, more contemplative. But Solomon didn't speak. He understood that awakening was a journey, and that everyone needed time to find their own answers. Michael lifted his head, his eyes still gazing out the airplane window. The light streaming through the glass illuminated his face, but it did little to dispel the turmoil etched deeply in his expression. His voice, hesitant and low, broke the silence, as though he were speaking more to himself than to Solomon. "You were right. Money doesn't solve everything." Solomon nodded gently. His eyes reflected understanding, tinged with a quiet sadness, as if he had heard those words many times before. "No," Solomon replied, his voice soft yet firm. "Money can buy safety. It can solve immediate problems. But it can't give your life meaning." Michael turned to look at Solomon, curiosity and profound conflict evident in his eyes. "And what is that meaning?" he asked, his voice steady but subdued. "What do you mean by helping the community? How can a company like yours change other people's lives?" Solomon smiled faintly. It wasn't a smug smile, but one of someone who had endured pain and come to understand the true value of his actions. He leaned back in his seat, his gaze drifting to the faint light of dawn breaking through the clouds outside. "I used to think like you," Solomon began, his voice measured. each word resonating in the quiet air between them. I thought success was about achieving what I wanted. A big house, fancy cars, the admiration of others. For a long time, I believed that was everything. He paused, as if carefully weighing his next words. But then I realized that success isn't about climbing to the top. It's about bringing as many people as you can with you. Michael furrowed his brow. Bringing others with you? What do you mean? Isn't it everyone's responsibility to take care of their own lives? Solomon shook his head lightly, his gaze steady and unwavering. It's not about responsibility. It's about choice. It's how I choose to define my success. He leaned forward, his voice lowering, each word carrying the weight of lived experience. You can have the biggest house, the nicest car. But if you don't do anything to help those left behind, you'll always feel empty. Michael froze, his thoughts churning as Solomon's words pierced through a part of him he hadn't acknowledged in years. He thought back to his sprawling house, the extravagant parties, the congratulatory words from colleagues and friends. Yet none of it had ever filled the hollow feeling he carried every time he walked into that house alone. "You're right," Michael murmured, almost to himself. "I have everything. So why do I still feel so empty?" Solomon tilted his head slightly, his gaze filled with compassion and patience. "We all forget that sometimes," he said softly. "The things outside of us keep us busy, make us believe we're living the right way. But eventually, when you sit in silence, you realize it's what you do for others that truly gives life meaning." Michael remained silent, absorbing every word. So, he lifted his head, his eyes reflecting deep contemplation. "Are you saying we should live for others? But where's the line? I've worked hard for years, earned my money. Is that wrong?" Solomon shook his head, his gentle smile still present. "No, that's not wrong. Working hard, earning money, building a life, those are all good things. But what I'm talking about is the next step." Michael frowned. "The next step?" Solomon nodded. "Once you've achieved those things, the next question is, what will you do with it?" Michael fell silent again, his eyes shining with the depth of his introspection. Solomon continued, "You can keep it all to yourself, but that will only leave you lonely. Or you can use it to create change for others." He paused, his eyes steady on Michael. "We can't live forever, but what we leave behind for others will outlive us." Michael lowered his head, whispering to himself, almost inaudibly, "I forgot that somewhere along the way." Solomon leaned back into his seat, his voice gentle yet imbued with the weight of a profound truth. "The important thing is what you do when you remember." Michael looked directly at Solomon. His eyes, once filled with doubt and skepticism, now held a newfound respect and admiration. He drew in a deep breath, as though shedding a burden he had carried for years. "Thank you," Michael said quietly. "Thank you for reminding me of that." Solomon nodded, his soft smile never wavering. "We all need reminders, Michael. That's why we're here, to help each other remember what truly matters." The atmosphere in the airplane cabin had gradually calmed. The passengers were settling down, their breaths steadying as the rhythmic hum of the engines resumed its familiar cadence. Michael remained in his seat, his gaze fixed on the window, yet his thoughts were consumed by every word Solomon had just spoken. Solomon turned toward him, his eyes reflecting a mix of contemplation and unshakable resolve. "We just launched a new program," he said, his voice steady but charged with emotion. Michael turned to face him, his attention fully captured. This program provides scholarships and skills training to underserved communities, people like my mother. People who would never have had a chance unless someone believed in them. Solomon paused for a moment, his hands clasped together on his lap as though grounding himself in the weight of his words. We don't just teach them how to make a living. We teach them how to stand up, how to believe in themselves, and how to create opportunities for those around them. Michael sat upright, his hands gripping the armrests of his seat. He no longer saw a billionaire sitting next to him. He saw a teacher, a true leader. Inside, the walls of prejudice he had built over the years began to crumble. Solomon's words weren't just about success. They were about responsibility, about using success to create real change in the world. Michael's thoughts raced, his heart heavy with realization. This is what true success looks like. Solomon's voice rang in his mind, unwavering and clear. I didn't build Drake Industries just to create technology. I built it to create a future where people like my mother can live with dignity and have equal opportunities. Michael felt a lump rising in his throat. He thought of his own life, all the years spent climbing the corporate ladder, driven by ambition but blind to compassion and the power of sharing. Now, he understood. Now, he saw that he needed to change. Michael turned to Solomon, his eyes filled with a sincerity and a quiet turmoil he had never shown before. He hesitated, as though wrestling with something deep within himself, before finally speaking. So, what can I do to start over? Solomon looked at him, a gentle smile appearing on his lips, though his eyes carried the weight of profound understanding. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he remained silent for a moment, as if carefully considering his response. At last, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small business card, placing it deliberately in Michael's hand. His movements were slow but resolute. Send me an email. Michael glanced down at the card, his hands trembling slightly. The words printed on it seemed to blur before his eyes, yet their meaning was unmistakable. Not just contact information, but an open door waiting for him to step through. Solomon continued, his voice soft but filled with quiet encouragement. I'll introduce you to a few friends in my organization. He paused, his gaze sharpening, though his warmth remained. We're not just going to talk about starting over. We'll rebuild together. Michael tightened his grip on the card. Thoughts swirled in his mind, but this time, they weren't dominated by doubt or fear. He stared at the small card in his hand, then exhaled a long, steady breath. It's not just a business card, he murmured, as though speaking to himself. It's an opportunity, an invitation. He lifted his head, a newfound determination shining in his eyes. For the first time in years, I feel like I can begin again. Solomon placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, a simple gesture carrying profound empathy. Life always gives us another chance, Solomon said, his voice steady and warm. The question is whether you're ready to take it. Michael lowered his head, his eyes brimming with resolve. And what if I fail again? He asked, his voice tinged with hesitation but also genuine curiosity. Solomon smiled, his grip on Michael's shoulder firm but reassuring. Then you get back up. He looked directly into Michael's eyes, his gaze filled with understanding and belief. Do you know the difference between those who succeed and those who give up? Solomon asked, his tone thoughtful. Michael shook his head. They never stop getting back up, no matter how many times they fall, Solomon said, his words soft but ringing with an undeniable truth. You only truly fail when you refuse to rise again. Michael fell silent, Solomon's words acting like a key unlocking a door he had kept closed for far too long. So, where do I start? Michael asked, his voice steadier than before. Solomon nodded, his eyes reflecting a deep empathy. "With yourself," Solomon replied. "With how you see yourself, how you treat others, and how you create value for the world." Michael bowed his head, murmuring to himself, "I've been waiting for a chance like this, and now, it's right here in my hands." He looked down at the card in his hand, as though it was more than just a small piece of paper, something far greater, a symbol of hope, a new beginning. Solomon watched Michael, nodding once more. "You're not alone. There are so many people out there who need a chance, just like you. And if you're willing to help them, we can create real change together." Michael lifted his head, his eyes blazing with determination. "So, when do we start?" Solomon smiled gently. "As soon as you're ready." The airplane flew steadily through the sky, breaking through the final remnants of the night's darkness. Outside the window, the dawn's light grew brighter. The sun began to rise over the horizon, casting away the lingering shadows. Golden-orange hues reflected off the clouds, painting the sky with a radiant glow of hope. Solomon leaned back in his seat, his hands loosely clasped on his lap. His eyes held a calmness, not passive, but resolute. It was the gaze of a man who understood that even the smallest actions could spark profound change. He glanced at Michael from the corner of his eye, offering a gentle smile. There was no need for more words. He knew he had planted a seed in the man's heart. And that seed, if nurtured, could grow into a tree whose shade would comfort many others. "What I've done here isn't just for one person. Maybe it could lead to something greater." Michael remained silent, his eyes fixed on the sky outside the window. He watched the first rays of dawn, feeling a profound shift within himself. During this journey, he had faced himself, his fears, his prejudices, his disappointments. But now, all of it seemed to dissolve, making room for a newfound sense of hope. He tightened his grip on the business card in his hand, as though holding onto a new opportunity, a promise to himself. "I thought it was over, that there were no more chances for me. But maybe this is the real beginning." He tilted his head slightly, the exhaustion and resentment that had once clouded his eyes replaced by determination and a faint glimmer of hope. In the airplane cabin, bathed in the light of the rising sun, both Solomon and Michael had found what they were searching for: faith, hope, and a reason to keep moving forward. The plane gently shuddered as its wheels touched down on the runway at Los Angeles Airport. A soft landing, like the closing chapter of a long and emotional journey. Morning light pierced through the clouds, streaming into the cabin through the small windows, painting the sky with a radiant golden hue. Michael gazed outside, his eyes following the runway as it rushed past. The dawn had fully broken, and its light seemed to reach deep inside him, casting out the shadows he had carried throughout this flight. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady and calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles. We thank you for your patience and cooperation during the flight. Have a wonderful day." Inside the cabin, tense faces began to relax. A round of applause rippled through the space, breaking the heavy silence that had lingered earlier. A few passengers stood to retrieve their bags, their expressions lighter, more at ease. Laughter and chatter started to fill the air, a wave of relief washing over the travelers after hours of unease. But amidst the commotion, Michael remained seated, his eyes fixed on the business card he still clutched tightly in his hand. Taking a deep breath, he rose to his feet. With purpose in his stride, he walked towards Solomon. His eyes no longer held doubt or reservation. Instead, they reflected deep respect and gratitude. He stopped beside Solomon's seat, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the card tucked into his pocket. "Thank you for everything." Michael's voice no longer wavered with hesitation or skepticism. It was steady, sincere, a true expression of gratitude from the heart. Solomon looked up at Michael, his gaze calm and resolute. He gave a small nod, a gentle smile gracing his lips. "This is just the beginning," Solomon said, his voice warm yet firm. "The rest is up to you." Michael nodded, his eyes gleaming with determination. "I won't waste this opportunity." Solomon placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, a gesture of quiet blessing and encouragement. "Good. Make it count, for yourself and for others." Michael stepped off the plane, the warmth of the morning sun washing over his face. Each step he took now felt steady, free of the uncertainty and weariness that had weighed him down before. He knew that as he passed through the airport doors, he was stepping into a new chapter of his life, a journey where he had rediscovered meaning after years of feeling lost. In his pocket, Solomon's business card remained, a reminder that every opportunity begins with action. Michael murmured softly, his eyes fixed on the glow of the sunrise ahead. "I've been waiting for a chance like this, and now I won't let it slip away." The morning sun bathed the quiet neighborhood in a warm glow. Michael stood before a sleek, modern building with a gleaming glass facade. The sign out front bore the words, "Drake Foundation, building bridges for the future." He furrowed his brow slightly, taking a deep breath. In his pocket, Solomon's business card rested, a card that had brought him to this pivotal moment. Stepping through the glass doors, Michael's eyes gleamed with a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer the lost man he had been a month ago, no longer drowning in emptiness and despair. Now, he was someone reclaiming the meaning of his life, rebuilding himself one step at a time. The interior of the building radiated warmth and vitality. The walls were adorned with photographs of the communities the foundation had touched, children with radiant smiles, adults proud of their new jobs, and snapshots of schools and skills centers built from scratch. Michael walked down the hallway, pausing to admire the photos. He felt the spirit of this place, a spirit he had long forgotten in his years of chasing career and wealth. He entered a small room where a group of young people sat waiting. Before him were eager but slightly anxious faces, youths from underprivileged communities, all seeking a chance to rewrite their stories. Michael stepped up to the podium, gripping a marker in his hand. He took a deep breath before beginning. "Good morning, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about how to craft a resume and prepare for job interviews." He looked down at the group, meeting their expectant gazes. "I know some of you might feel like you don't have enough opportunities, like you don't measure up to other candidates out there." Michael paused, letting his words sink in, his eyes scanning the room. "But remember this, every single one of you deserves a chance. What matters is that you believe in yourself and are ready to seize that chance when it comes." A few of the young people nodded, determination lighting up their eyes. As the session ended, Michael watched the hopeful faces filing out of the room, each carrying a flicker of optimism about the future. He stood still for a moment, overwhelmed by emotion. "I used to think success was about money and status. I spent years climbing the corporate ladder, only to realize I was climbing the wrong one." He looked down at his hands that once signed high-stakes contracts, now holding training materials meant to help others find their way. "But now I see, the true meaning of success is helping others find theirs." Michael returned to his desk. On it sat a small photo frame, a picture of Solomon and the Drake Foundation team smiling at the opening of a new education center. Beside it was a notebook, its pages filled with Michael's new goals. Help at least 10 people secure jobs this month. Create a soft skills training program for youth in underserved communities. Never forget why I started this journey." He smiled faintly, his heart swelling with a sense of hope and purpose he hadn't felt in years. "Life has given me another chance, and this time, I won't let it slip away." A month after that emotional landing, Michael stood in front of the Drake Foundation headquarters, the place that had changed his life. The Los Angeles sky was a vivid blue, and the morning sunlight illuminated the large sign that read, "Drake Foundation, building bridges for the future." Michael stepped inside, his strides now steady, each step filled with a newfound sense of purpose. He was no longer the lost man, drowning in doubt and despair. He was someone rebuilding his life, and this time, he had found his true calling. As he walked through the hallway, a familiar voice called out from behind, "I knew you could do it." Turning around, Michael saw Solomon Drake standing there, his face calm but warm, carrying that same unshakable confidence. Michael approached, extending his hand to Solomon. "Thank you, Solomon. Thank you for giving me a chance to start over." Solomon smiled, his handshake firm and reassuring, just like the man himself. "No need to thank me. You found your own way." Michael nodded, his eyes reflecting a deep gratitude. "I used to think success was about what I could achieve for myself. But now I understand. True success is about what I can do for others." Solomon released his hand, placing it gently on Michael's shoulder like a mentor offering a final word of encouragement. "That's right," Solomon replied, his voice steady and full of meaning. "Success isn't about where you end up. It's about the journey you take and the people you help along the way." Michael glanced toward a classroom where young people sat attentively, waiting for the lesson he was about to teach. He drew in a deep breath, feeling the crisp morning air, a sense of freedom and renewal he hadn't felt in years. He no longer sought success for himself. He sought purpose in helping others. Looking at the eager faces before him, Michael smiled softly. He knew that with every person he helped, another piece of his life's puzzle fell into place. During the training session, Michael stood before the group and said, "I used to think failure was my greatest enemy. But I've learned that failure isn't the scariest thing. The scariest thing is letting fear and doubt hold you back from moving forward." He paused, meeting the focused gazes of his audience. Life always gives us another chance. The question is whether we have the courage to take it. After the session, Michael stepped out of the room and stood by a large window, gazing at the vast blue sky. In the distance, birds soared freely, strong and unrestrained, much like how he felt now. He murmured to himself, almost as a promise, "I've been waiting for a chance like this, and now I won't let it slip away." If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit subscribe and check out more meaningful content on our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what lesson stood out to you.